All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this installment of the APLS Student Committee webinar series. The American Psychology Law Society is Division 41 of the American Psychological Association and includes scholars, researchers, and practitioners of various disciplines who work at the intersection of psychology and law. The APLS Student Committee provides an array of resources and experiences for student members interested in psychology and law, including these webinars. The purpose of the webinars is to engage our student members in regular, interactive discussions with field leaders in psychology and law. We aim to strengthen the student committee within APLS and also provide our student members with translatable skills needed to succeed in their current and future clinical, empirical, and legal practices. We're very excited to present Dr. Jacqueline Evans, Zoe Klemfuss, and Dr. Lindsay Malloy, who will be discussing research postdocs today with you. My name is Erica Fountain, and I'm the experimental liaison for the student committee, and I'll be your moderator today. A few logistics before we get started. We have individuals attending this webinar on their computers and also on their phones. So the interactive features of the webinar, including slides, polls, questions, and things like this, will only be available to those accessing the webinar on their computers. This webinar will be a mix of presentations and questions, so please use the chat box in the bottom left corner of your screen to write in questions at any point throughout the webinar today. If you have questions before the Q&A session, feel free to go ahead and put them in the chat box, and I'll bring them up during the Q&A session. There's also the option of asking your question live, which we will cover at the beginning of the Q&A section of the webinar. All right, so this webinar is being recorded and will be available on the student committee website within a few days. If there are any logistical questions for me throughout the webinar today, please write those in the chat box as well. Again, we're super excited to present Drs. Evans, Dr. Klemfuss, and Dr. Malloy to talk about what you can do after your degree, a panel discussion on the Elusive research postdoc. Hello, Dr. Evans, Dr. Klemfuss, and Dr. Malloy, and thank you for joining us. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Erica, and thanks for including us on this event. So basically what we're going to do is we're each going to tell you a little bit about our postdoc experiences, so you can kind of get a sense of what is similar across our experiences and what varies a little bit. There are some slides that we have provided. We're not really going to go over them so much. They're more just to be a resource for you, but if you have questions about anything in particular, do let us know. So I'll start. I'm Jackie Evans. I did my postdoc from 2008 to 2011 with Chris Meisner at UT El Paso. And the way I got my postdoc, which I think we're all going to talk about, is I knew Chris ahead of time, not particularly well, but we had overlapped. He had been a faculty member where I was a graduate student for 1 year. And I'd worked with him on one project. So I approached him fairly early on, about a year and a half maybe before my postdoc would have started, just to bring up the possibility of whether he was interested in having a postdoc, whether he saw any prospects for that. And so he indicated he was going to be writing up a grant and would try and put in a postdoc, try and fund me in case that seemed like a good option for me at the time. So luckily for me, that ended up working out, and so I spent 3 years there. So my first year of funding was on Chris's grant, but once I got there, I wrote my own grant and funded my postdoc for the next 2 years. So his grant was through the Department of Defense, and mine was an intelligence community postdoctoral research fellowship. However, I think they've discontinued that particular program, or at least they temporarily have. I think they cut the budget. Thanks, Congress. So my experience as a postdoc, again, I'll tell you what mine was and you can get a sense of whether it's typical or not once you hear what these two have done. I had a fair bit of freedom to do my own research. There were certain projects that I was expected to make a priority, but sometimes there was a lot more work to be done on those projects, and sometimes there really wasn't that much to be done, and I could really focus on what I wanted to be doing. For me, it worked out well because I had a lot of projects from when I was a graduate student that were still kind of in the pipeline, so I could use that time to focus on writing those up, doing revisions, so that by the time I left my postdoc, my CV looked substantially better than it did at the time that I left grad school. Even though it's important to realize that a fair bit of what you do in your postdoc will not be published when you're on the job market the next time, because there is that lag. So the postdoc in and of itself, you may not have those publications to show for it immediately. Some of the things that I did, I was kind of in many ways the lab manager for the lab because I was the only postdoc in that lab. And so that also meant sometimes I was kind of Chris 2.0. If he couldn't do something, I was the person who automatically was picked to go take care of it. That went from anything from teaching a class if he was out of town to if he was invited to present somewhere and he couldn't go, I was the person who pretty much always was sent to do that. I helped to mentor his graduate students. That was especially after he left and went to Washington, D.C. to work for the NSF for a few years. And so I tried to mentor his students while he was away. Even while he was there, part of my job included helping them with their projects, consulting with them. If they submitted papers to APLS, I read their submissions and gave them comments. So I was definitely there in part to be a mentor to the students in his lab and even some of the other students in the legal psychology program. I did get a fair variety of experience. So I taught a graduate class, which wasn't fairly, it was not all that typical. I don't think that many people teach, but I did teach a grad class. I also helped him kind of administering his grants. And so that was a good experience to not only write a grant, but then get the experience of kind of working on the other side of the grant once you have it and trying to figure out how to budget things and how to pay people and what kind of paperwork is involved with that kind of thing. So just a couple pros of doing a postdoc. If you don't have wonderful letters of recommendation or you don't have a lot of letters of recommendation, a postdoc gives you at least one more person who's going to be able to write you a strong letter of recommendation when you go on the job market the next time. And it also just builds your connections because now you've gone to a new university that has a whole new group of people for you to connect with, possibly develop collaborations with. So that's all I'll say about mine for now, and I'll go ahead and hand it over to Dr. Malloy.
Hi, I'm Lindsay Malloy. I did my postdoc with Michael Lamb at the University of Cambridge from 2008, so June of 2008 to December 2010, so about 2.5 years. And when we all agreed to do this, we all sort of said, well, I don't know if I'm the most representative person in terms of how I got my postdoc. But then since all three of us had those experiences, we thought maybe they were fairly representative of how people get postdocs. So my story was that I was actually out to dinner at a conference with several colleagues of Michael Lamb's. He wasn't at this particular conference. And I just said, it would be so amazing to do a postdoc with Michael Lamb in the future. And one of his colleagues said, I'm pretty sure he's hiring a postdoc right now. And so when I got back home from the conference, I hadn't quite proposed my dissertation yet. So I was probably 1.5 years out from finishing. And so I wasn't really thinking about that stuff at that point. Maybe I should have been, but I wasn't. And so I went back and I looked up the ad for the postdoc, and it was like it was written for me. It was perfect. The research that they wanted done, the topics, except for the part where it said you had to speak Hebrew to get the postdoc. And so I just decided to ignore that part of the ad and applied for the postdoc anyway, and didn't mention in there that I didn't speak Hebrew. It was related to the project that he wanted someone to run. And so I was interviewed for it. The interview lasted for about 10 minutes. It was long, from the UK to California. It was at 7 in the morning. And I thought it went really horribly bad, really, really badly. And I thought I'm not going to work in the field again, let alone get this postdoc. But within a few hours, I found out that they had hired someone else for the postdoc. Wait, it gets better though. And it was in fact someone who spoke Hebrew, had been working on their team for a while, and who they chose to run this particular project. But Michael had lots of other funds, discretionary funds, sort of, I think, like a startup package for when he went to Cambridge. And so he said, I would still like to hire you as a postdoc for when you finish. So that was how it worked out. And so I didn't go on the job market. I didn't go on the postdoc market. I had the postdoc of my dreams, basically, and decided not to pursue anything else. So I just worked on finishing my dissertation and went there as soon as I did. And my postdoc, I had a lot of freedom to do what I wanted to do. I wasn't hired to work on a particular project. Michael really wanted me to write a big grant on autism and memory, which we did. And so that was a challenge because I didn't know anything about the autism literature, so I had to, learn that really quickly. And so that was the main thing that was sort of required of me. I worked on a lot of studies that, I came up with him, edited a book, worked on a chapter with him, wrote a couple of grants. I was really kind of treated like a faculty member in a lot of ways. I went to faculty meetings there. I did some light teaching in the Oxbridge system, like supervising, but teaching 3 or 4 students at a time. But that was totally my choice. I signed up for that. I worked with some of his graduate students and mentored some light mentoring of his master's and PhD students and honors students as well. So yeah, I'll stop there.
Okay. I am Zoe Klemfuss, and I did my postdoc from 2011 to 2013, just about 2 years exactly, under Jody Quass at the University of California, Irvine. So let's see, I'm going to follow the general theme here. So I got my postdoc the informal way as well. So I had met Jody a couple of times through other colleagues and at conferences, and basically I heard through the grapevine that she had just received a grant, a postdoc was already written in, and she didn't have someone in mind. And I followed Jody's work for years, and that was very exciting to me. So I just emailed her, said, hey, I would love to work with you, any chance that's possible? And she said yes. And that's basically how that went. We had a very, very informal meeting at a conference after that, partially because the grant was actually co-written with Tom Lyon, who's at a different site. He's in the law school, actually, at USC. So the idea was I could sort of split my time as much as I wanted to between the 2 sites, and I had not met Tom previously. But it was very casual, very supportive. It was basically made to seem like it was kind of a done deal because our interests matched up, and I had already known Jody for a while. So that's kind of how it happened. A lot of luck, I think. A lot of luck and some work ahead of time, just making sure that you know people in the field and make connections and try not to make bad impressions on people. That's kind of really big one in academia, it turns out. So in the postdoc, the postdoc was funded on a pre-existing grant that Jody and Tom had. But that being said, I was still given an astounding amount of flexibility, actually. So I also had a similar experience to Jackie and Lindsay in that I really got to sort of pick which projects I worked on within very loose parameters. So they should fall under the general heading of existing grants that I was being funded on. But really, I felt like I could just pursue the areas of research that I was interested in, and that was really important to me. It was also something I was looking for and looking for signs that was going to be the case before I pursued the postdoc. So kind of usual. So worked on lots of studies and again, very light mentoring of graduate students, more like Lindsay than Jackie. I think you ended up doing quite a bit of mentoring. I did not. I hired my own team of undergraduate RAs, so I was mentoring them directly. So I sort of worked passively on grants. I would sort of help with revisions and things on grants that were going in, that were Joey's and or Tom's. Chapter. So also, again, typical academic things, but I did no teaching at all. And that was, I think, really helpful for me and part of the reason why the postdoc was a nice time to just really focus in and get extra research training, because you can really focus your time on the research end if that's the kind of postdoc you choose to pursue. And for me, that was really important to me. So I could get training in a different area, expand my skills and my methodology, and that's really great experience.
No, I was just going to add that I didn't know so I knew you kind of knew Chris and worked in the ground, and you had met Jody. I'd met Jody or Michael once or twice. I definitely
met Jody
more
was
than my graduate. And so I met Michael, I think, once really briefly at a conference, but I wouldn't have said that I knew him. I just
followed his work.
Oh, it was similar for me.
Yeah.
Actually.
Okay.
Okay.
I think a key point too that Zoe brought up is that your postdoc ideally should expand your expertise. So when I did my postdoc, I was coming in with some history of doing interviewing of witnesses. That's what I focused on for example, my dissertation. But when I joined Chris's lab, my kind of focus changed to interrogations. So something similar, so I was, reasonably qualified, but it left me with a lot of new knowledge and a lot of new expertise that I didn't have. So ideally, you want your postdoc to expand your skills, not just be exactly what you've already been doing.
Yeah. So I was actually on a postdoc panel yesterday. So the nice thing is it's with different colleagues. So I can share with you a little bit more about what these colleagues, their experiences were. None of them were in the legal field, the psych law field, but just general psychology. But yeah, the three of us all thought that we were these outliers for having sort of these informal ways of getting postdocs, like I think Jackie mentioned at the beginning. But it turns out this seems like it's actually the norm. So on the panel of 4 yesterday, it was exactly the same across the board, where everyone applied relatively informally. What varies is where the funding comes from, I think. But I think that varies a bit more. So like Jackie came in on 1 year funding and then got her own funding for the remainder of the grant. So there are postdoc funds that you can apply to now beforehand, which A, makes you really desirable to go where you need to go, right, if you come with your own money. And B, they're a great line on your CV. It's great practice writing a grant. So we've included some links to those funding mechanisms, the ones that we're aware of and where you can find those. It just really opens up doors if there's somebody who's maybe in between funding, doesn't have sufficient funding, or hasn't written a postdoc into recent grants. But relatedly, the reason I bring this up now is the point Jackie was making about how your postdoc is supposed to expand your knowledge base. My understanding is that for these postdoc grants, you necessarily need to prove that you're expanding your knowledge base. So you cannot apply for a grant that's so much in this is anyway my understanding, that was so much in your own line that you're not actually getting training. So especially if it's one of these, I don't know, did we post a link to the T32 grant?
I think so. I don't know.
So especially for these grants that are specifically geared toward training you, if you can't make an argument that you're learning some type of new skill or a new research area, they're not that impressed. They don't think you have more training to do. So it's just something to keep in mind.
Just in terms of whether a postdoc is a good fit for you, or whether you should take a postdoc versus take a faculty position, I think my general advice, and obviously everybody's situation is different and a big decision, you have to weigh what your priorities are. My thought would be, if you get a position, like a tenure track position somewhere, that's somewhere that you would actually want to stay for at least several years, then you should probably take that over a postdoc. If, on the other hand, you get a position that perhaps you really want to do research and it's a straight teaching position, then maybe taking the postdoc makes more sense to make you more competitive later. But the key is going to be that will your CV actually be more competitive later? Just because you have the line saying I was a postdoc, my personal opinion is that's not actually worth that much in and of itself. It's worth the fact that you have a good letter from probably somebody who's a big deal. It's worth the fact that you should now have grant writing experience, and you should have mentorship experience, and you should have more publications because you got things out that hadn't had a chance to get out yet. But the postdoc in and of itself probably doesn't carry that much weight. So if you don't have anything that's really going to change on your CV other than the line saying, I did a postdoc, the postdoc may not be that valuable to you. So that's my take on it. I don't know if you guys would agree with that.
Again, unless there's an area that you're not trained in that you want to move into. So if the actual training itself will make a difference in terms of, for me, I wanted to learn more about the area of stress and memory, and I didn't know anything. Nobody at my graduate university really focused on that area, but Jody did, and Jody's, does great work in that area, so I could learn that from her, and that was important to me as well. So just one other thing you might consider. Is there something that you're really curious about learning about that you can apply and make yourself also, it's a nice way to make yourself more novel, right? Make yourself more unique. So if you find a way to merge other areas of research by doing your graduate area in one area, or your graduate research in one area and your postdoctoral research in another. That makes you a little bit more unique.
And I just wanted to do one. I mean,
Yeah,
for the sake of everybody I talked to, people like Candace Odgers, they all talked about their postdocs with such glowing, in such glowing terms. They just loved that part of their lives. And, it was sort of like this, I can come into my own during my postdoc. And I honestly didn't feel ready to do a faculty job. And I'm glad that I didn't, because I wouldn't have been, I don't think, looking at it now. And there's so many things that get thrust on you with a faculty job. So many extra things that take away your research time that are not there during many postdocs anyway, that are not there during many postdocs. And so it was just a chance to do that. And for me, it was moving to another country for 2.5 years and having that experience. So I didn't even look for faculty jobs, but that is not necessarily the way to go, because I already knew that I had it. I don't know. Should we?
Just one more thing. So, another thing is, you should not consider the postdoc as a way to bide your time while you figure out if academia is right for you. At least in my opinion, because the idea of a postdoc is it's very self-driven. I mean, I guess technically you could just sort of post on somebody else's money and not produce that much while you're there, but the idea is like postdoc can be really fun and really exciting and a really great way to get a lot of research done, but you're still self-motivated, right? So your postdoc mentor typically is not going to be forcing you to do this or really imposing a structure on you typically. So it still needs to come from, I really enjoy this is somewhere I want to be, if you really want to make the most of your time there. That's just kind of.
I do think there is some variation. I have heard stories about people who do a postdoc where the mentor is very much, you need to be doing 40 hours a week or however many hours on the project you've been hired to work on, and you can do whatever you want on your other time. So that's a question you should probably ask if that's going to be an issue for you. If you're expecting a lot of freedom, that's not a guarantee that you will get that much freedom. So that's something that's worth asking about and looking into. If that person has had postdocs before, you might want to ask those postdocs, what is it like to be the postdoc? I personally, just something else to think about is whether you're going somewhere that has a culture of postdocs, has had a lot of them. When I was in El Paso, there were like none. And it was kind of a weird place to be in that you weren't a student, but you weren't faculty. The other faculty don't even necessarily know you exist in the world. You don't go to faculty meetings. Some places you might, but I didn't go to faculty meetings. I wasn't on thesis committees or dissertation committees or any of that kind of thing that gets you to know other people. But you're also not in classes, so you're not meeting other students. So it's kind of a weird situation in some ways to just be floating in between faculty and student. It's nice to not have those obligations, but it is a little weird to not fit into a clear group. But other places have a lot of postdocs, and so that's not an issue, and you kind of get integrated into that group. So that's just something to know. I don't really know if you make a decision based on that, but it's just something to be aware of.
We might. Well, even so at UCI, there wasn't a big culture of postdocs. So I was Jody's first, really, of her own postdocs. And I think I was perhaps the only one there when I was there, but I think, were you physically located somewhere else? You were in the middle.
I was the department was in 2 buildings, and so I was in a smaller other building, so that's really helpful. But
yeah, so yeah, I mean, I was worried about the same thing. It turned out to be not that bad for me, but I was also just like, it was really silly convenient stuff. Like my office was in the main hallway, so like faculty would walk by me every time they went anywhere, so they just kind of saw me. And then there were a lot of like talks and things they could go to. So I think it really just depends. So on the culture as a whole, even so whether there's a postdoc culture or whether there's even just like a really integrated culture, like Lindsay sounds like you have the extreme version of that.
Yeah, at Cambridge there was, tons of postdocs. The university functions a great deal on postdocs. So we had postdoc associations, postdoc dinners, and it was very easy to have a lot of other people who were doing the same kind of thing. Should we open up for questions? Yeah.
Sure. Let's go ahead and move into the Q&A session then. I just wanted to go ahead and remind people about how they can ask questions. You can go ahead and type your questions in the chat box, but also if you want to have the opportunity to ask your question live, I guess, you can do so by raising your hand. And you can raise your hand by clicking on My Mood on the top of the screen. And then there's a button that says Raise Hand from the options menu. And then I'll call on you and unmute you so you can ask your questions. So to give people a few minutes to start thinking about the questions they want to ask and to start typing them, I'm going to open it up with a question that we had someone send us beforehand. And I think this is a good general one to ask to all of you just to start it and to open it up for questions. That is, what do you wish you knew before applying to or starting your postdoc?
I wish I'd known more about what a postdoc was. Quite honestly, to me, I'd never actually talked to somebody who had done a postdoc when I started. I honestly didn't even know, like my parents were asking me, right? Like, but what is a postdoc? And I didn't really have a particularly great answer. So quite honestly, just having a session like this would have been really helpful just to get a sense of what it actually means, kind of day to day, what kind of tasks are you working on? Because I knew very little about what I signed up for.
I don't know. I wish that I had, well, I don't know if it's something I wish I had known. I wish that I had done things a little bit differently in terms of, I mean, I had an amazing postdoc and I was very productive during it, but I wish I had been a little bit more strategic in how I thought about things and how I started and what I did when I was there, because I kind of just, went in a lot of different directions, which I guess isn't that different than what I do now, and somehow it all works out. But I wish I had been a little bit more strategic in my planning before I got there. But it was hard to know exactly what to expect, like Jackie said. But I think once I got there, I could have formulated things a little bit better. I could have said no to a couple things that, looking back, probably weren't the best use of my time, and were things that I volunteered for or said yes for. Service type things like organizing a conference for the undergraduate students, for example. Yeah, I know. I just said yes to a lot of things.
Yeah, wow.
Well, I still do that. And so I'm getting better. But it, that you really want it to be like the research and writing time. There are other things I said yes to that some people would have said, oh, maybe you shouldn't have spent time on that. I edited a book, which ended up taking a lot of time. But actually, that was strategic. I mean, I think that editing that book was a really good experience in many ways, and I definitely wouldn't change that. So just being more strategic in advance, I think, and sticking to that plan.
I'm going to have to give a lame answer. I'm glad you guys gave good ones. There are so many things that I didn't know and still don't know that it's hard to pick just one that I wish I knew then. I mean, it's a great, and that's kind of a positive thing. So that's to say that I learned a lot, not just, topic-wise, but just sort of tacit knowledge-wise or awareness of the field-wise during my postdoc. But for me, there wasn't anything that was shocking or upsetting that I learned it. It was all really positive and exciting. And part of that was, well, Jody, if you're listening, Jody was great. And she did a really nice job sort of mentoring me and helping me navigate things. So nothing ever felt like an insurmountable challenge that I didn't, the fact that I didn't know something didn't seem like a problem. So we sort of worked through it. So for me, I can't think of anything at the moment that was really problematic that I didn't know it when I started.
I wish I'd known actually that you still have to file your taxes in the U.S. if you live out of the country. So just if you do a postdoc out of the country, don't think that you don't have to do that, because it can really be unpleasant when you return to the country. So there are things that I learned about leaving and coming back that are challenging, but that probably won't apply to most people.
You guys mentioned T grants. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the different types of grants available to students who want to apply for postdocs.
I can try. So the T grant is a training grant. So it's actually granted to the institution. I don't know much more than that, except for that it's basically, it funds lines for postdocs, and it can be multiple postdocs. But it's something that, you can work on, but really it's going to the institution where you're going, and it just creates a position for you. Whereas the F line are fellowships, so they're things that you apply for that fund you specifically. It's sort of your grant with a mentor, so someone else works on it with you, because you have to have a mentorship training plan. Except that's about the extent of my understanding, but that's.
And those are really great too. I mean, I doubt that there's any faculty member who has an active lab who wouldn't love somebody who's interested in their research coming with their own money to work in their lab. I think, the only issue could maybe be finding space for you to work, but I don't know.
But if you're coming with money, the university will
they'll
find you space. Yeah.
So I think if like the NRSA, that's what the that's also known as the NRSA, or the National Research Service Award, through NIH.
I mean, NSF has some postdocs, but I believe most of them you need to. It's not that you write it on your own. There's an advisor who is also on it, who's the PI, and a lot of grants are kind of weird like that, but that doesn't mean you can't write it. So the grant that I got that funded my postdoc for the last 2 years, technically Chris was the PI, but I wrote it and submitted it, and and we had that agreement ahead of time that I knew that that's what was going to happen, that it was going to technically say that he was the PI, but we agreed that on his CV he says it as it was a student's grant or a mentee's grant or something like that. So you could always speak with somebody and say, I'm really interested in doing this. Can I write a grant? And you can be part of it, but you can still take the lead, and then take some of the burden off of them, and that'll always help.
I think because there's a question that we got too about potential questions that is saying, how should I approach the subject of co-writing a large grant with a potential advisor? My advice, like to piggyback off of what Jackie said, would be to do as much of the work as you can. So if you're approaching someone about wanting to work in their lab, and they have to be involved in the grant writing course and figuring out the project, but you want to make sure that you're really carrying the brunt of that work, because it is going to fund you. And I think people would be much more likely to say yes to it if it's going to be something you're primarily taking care of.
And I mean, a lot of grants, even if they don't have a specific postdoc mechanism, you can write in a postdoc. So one of the links I provided is for the HIG, the High Value Detainee Interrogation Group, so I put the link to their announcement. It's probably too late at this point for most people to submit anything for this year, but I know multiple postdocs who have been funded through that mechanism, even though it's not a postdoc mechanism per se. So if you approach somebody and they say, oh, I'm working on a grant right now, depending on what it is, they may be able to write in funding for a postdoc. That wouldn't really change even the project itself. It would just require more funding. So it doesn't always have to be a specific mechanism that is just for postdocs.
Before I ask the next question, I just want to remind people that if you guys want to ask questions, don't be shy. Feel free to type them in the chat box on the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. One of the other questions we had emailed to us kind of got at the question of what your everyday look like. Are you more of a research assistant, or are you more of a collaborator? And I know you guys talked a little bit about this and about how much liberty you had to do your own things, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that day-to-day, like what did your typical Monday look like as a postdoc?
I would say it was, I mean, there were days, so depending on the project, right? Because while I was a postdoc, I was working on multiple different things. And on some, they were much more mine, and maybe I would run something by Chris just to say, hey, this is what we're thinking, or something like that. But it was pretty much up to me, and it was much more of a collaborator / I'm really the
Can you hear me?
Hello.
Erica?
Can you hear us through the phone?
I can hear you now.
Oh, yay. Okay.
Um,
Sorry, everyone. Don't know what happened. The microphone just randomly stopped working.
the joys of technology. Yeah.
So
Great. Everyone seems to be able to hear you now.
Okay,
Great.
okay. Thank you. Sorry about that. What were we answering? Now I'm all thrown off.
I have no idea.
It was about, so I was saying I was more of a collaborator than a research assistant. I do know that people who've had postdocs where they were very much just research assistant type of, where they were collecting data themselves, they were running participants. That definitely wasn't the case for me. I worked in a kind of separate building too, so Michael wouldn't have even known if I was there most days. I was, but it wouldn't have. There wasn't day to day. I had a lot of freedom, which, as you may know, can be a really good thing, and also not the greatest thing if there's not you have to be very self motivated if there's no structure to your day. So, Zoe, I don't know if you.
Yeah, same. Definitely felt like a collaborator. I really felt like it was a nice thing because it felt like all of my time was being well spent, if that makes sense.
Oh yeah. So I meant to add. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that now, like as a faculty member, there are so many days where, especially the first 2 years, not to throw you off, not to scare you too much about, but do a postdoc. But there are so many days now where, and especially the first 2 years, where I get to about 4 o'clock or 4:30 and think, okay, now I can start my real work, and do it for as long as I can before I go to bed. So it feels like a huge portion of your day as a faculty member is caught up with all sorts of tiny little things that take up huge amounts of time, but that don't actually move your research forward. Whereas during the postdoc, it was like writing and research the whole time almost. So that's a huge difference. All right. More questions?
Does anyone have any questions for the panel? We have about 15 more minutes with them, so speak now.
There's a question on here that says, is the postdoc a good time to finish writing up my graduate work? Which I can speak to for a minute. I think what Jackie was saying is yes, it is, in the sense that when you finish your graduate work, obviously much of that is not going to be ready to be under review, especially your dissertation. But I would encourage you to write that up and to work on it as soon as possible when you start your postdoc. Don't let it drag on into your postdoc, because you'll get there and there'll be all these exciting new projects that you want to work on, and so those projects that you've been dealing with for years that you're just trying to finish up just don't have the same appeal anymore, and they can drag on for a long time. I think I didn't submit my dissertation until a year after starting my postdoc, which I should have done in the first month to just get it out of the way. And you're at risk of, never quite getting those things in or published before you finish your postdoc if you don't do it right away. So yes, you can do that, sometimes on your own time, sometimes as part of the postdoc, but do it early. It will also look weird if you're, still publishing with, well, not weird, but, you may not want to still be publishing 5 years later with your graduate advisor. You want to get those out sooner.
I'll go ahead and ask you another question from the list. So someone asked a question about what happens if you're interested in a faculty position that has you want to do more teaching, right? So you're interested in a faculty position that has more teaching. Is a postdoc still relevant for you?
That can depend. So some postdocs do give you an option to do some teaching, but on the whole, it's not the idea behind a postdoc. So you're better off just going into a teaching position or even sticking around as a lecturer at your current university. I mean, I think. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, if you have the option to take a faculty position, then I would take that. But if you don't get that position, then probably postdoc would be good, in that you probably will have an option to teach if you'd like to. And even for a teaching school, the better your CV looks research-wise, that makes you more competitive. That said, if you can get the teaching job or a faculty position, then that probably makes more sense than the postdoc.
And I have recently, I put up the APS postdoc exchange link on one of the slides, but I have seen teaching postdocs too, where teaching is a big component of the postdoc. Yeah, it's that first one there. And so, you may be able to take one of those if teaching position is something that you're more interested in.
Another option might be, so at least one friend of mine was in a postdoc that gave her some freedom to work on the outside of her postdoc, so it just which is unusual. So that's something you have to check about. So she was actually able to take an adjunct teaching position at the same time as she was doing her postdoc. Maybe a bad example if she didn't end up going into academia or teaching, but she technically did it. So it gave her extra teaching experience while she was getting research experience, but they were two different universities.
And if you end up in a postdoc and then you've kind of decided, actually, I think I want to go into teaching, something you can sell is if you're mentoring the undergrads in the lab or mentoring the graduate students, you can talk about that like in a teaching statement and really stress that. And any teaching school is going to want you to have that kind of experience, so you can kind of sell that particular aspect of it.
There are also other postdocs that I listed on there, like the AAAS policy fellowships or the SRCD policy fellowships, which are not a traditionally research postdocs, but may have an element of research in them. And so those kinds of positions, if you want to go the R1 route, they may not be the best thing because your time ends up being spent doing a lot of other things policy related, but they could be something that would be really appealing if you were going into a teaching school. And I'm not saying they're not appealing if you're going into more research, because I don't have time to go into all the details of these, but I learned about them a couple of years ago, and they sound like really amazing opportunities where you're placed within like NSF or NIH or at the FBI. And the FBI apparently actually wants people who are going to work on their own research while they're there, and they also deal with like policy and legislation and things like that. But it's really interesting skill set that you're going to get from that you can probably frame and tailor in different ways depending on what kind of position you're going to after. And, the FBI, they actually, which is really relevant to a lot of psych law people, they actually want you to do your own research while you're there too, which is really cool.
But I have two colleagues who did the SRCD policy fellowships, I think both at NIH, I want to say. And they're both in research positions now. Yes. Although one of them's at a more teaching-heavy school, but they both went the academic route after doing policy fellowships. The caveat being for both of them, policy was integral with their research area. So, they may not have been, I actually don't know, they may not have been quite as publishing productive as they would have been otherwise, at least not in academic journals necessarily, but they're probably doing more policy work, and that policy work counts when your research area is policy.
Yeah, for sure.
One thing that isn't on there that I'm just going to keep talking is how long you should do a postdoc for. Well, I guess there is one question that hits that. So if you have, you may not have a choice. I know yours was initially 1 year, but you wrote a grant to stay longer. A 1 year postdoc, I think, would be really, really tough, especially if you're moving for it, and especially if you're moving overseas for it. It takes a while to get into a place and get settled and start being productive and start getting used to a new lab and, even getting email accounts set up and all that sort of thing. So, and if you go for a 1 year one, you are basically on the job market from the first day that you arrive. Like if you arrive in August, you're going to start applying for the jobs
in September, October, November for the following year. And that takes up a huge portion of your time. So 2 years, I would say, is the minimum that you would want to have if you're going to do a postdoc. And I would actually think 3 is about perfect from my experience. But obviously it's going to vary. And if you get your dream job during the second year, of course, like look at us, for example. Yeah, exactly. So if you get that, then great. But otherwise, I think 3 is a really great number. That's my opinion.
Next on the panel yesterday was 6.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean,
she moved formally into it. Like, at least in label, she became a research assistant professor at the same university, but it was essentially a research postdoc.
I actually did that too, and I honestly, even though I did it, don't really understand it. But in the 3rd year of my postdoc, they changed my title to research assistant professor.
Yeah. Because Jody did tell me, it's going to look a bit weird if you're like on your 5th year as a postdoc or something like that. So, and that's really common for the hard sciences, but not so much for us. Well, she was saying the other reason is because if you're a postdoc, you're not eligible for the same independent grants, right? So you still can't be a PI.
Right.
So by switching, she was able to start applying for her own.
Yeah, so that makes sense. Any other burning questions in the last few minutes?
All right. Well, if there aren't any last-minute questions, I think now is a good time to go ahead and wrap up. So just before we go, I just want to say thanks to you guys, to Dr. Evans, Dr. Klemfuss, and to Dr. Malloy. It's so hard to do that over and over again. So thank you so much for speaking today with us about research postdocs. For everyone who attended, we hope this webinar provided you with relevant and useful information. And please feel free to reach out to the panel or to the student committee if you have any further questions. The recording of this webinar will be available on the student committee website shortly. We invite everyone to check out the webinar page for a listing of our upcoming webinars as well as an archive of our past webinars. And I'm going to go ahead and put that link in the chat box for you all now. Also, keep a lookout for information about our next webinar that's going to be held in May. You can check out the student committee website or our Facebook and Twitter pages for the registration info. And if you would be so kind, I'm going to go ahead and send a survey link about this webinar. If you could complete that right now or right at the end of this webinar, that would be most helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat as well. All right, so thank you again to our panel and to everyone who participated today, and we hope to see you at our next webinar next month.
Thanks, Erica. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Bye.